We're going to get started. There are a couple people who haven't shown up, and I'm sure they'll find seats as we go. But we always like to keep these things on time, and I really appreciate the time that's been given by these two very busy gentlemen. Both are running theaters, both are directors, both have going to spend an hour with us to talk about directing, which I really appreciate. Now, those of you who don't know Nicholas Ballas, he has been directing, producing, acting, coaching, in every kind of medium in Santa Fe and elsewhere. Mostly here.
Some used to it.
And right now he is directing this production, which is Simpatico, written by Sam Shepard. And he and Sam have known each other in what was the decade?
In the 80s.
In the 80s. So these will be interesting stories. Colin Hovde is new to Santa Fe. We're very lucky to have him. He comes to us from Washington, D.C., where he was producing artistic director of Theater Alliance. And he's directed everywhere from the Rustaveli Theatre in Tiblisi, Georgia, to the Kennedy Center. And we are very lucky to have him here at the Santa Fe Playhouse. So one of the things that I would like to do is to get us started. I have set a list of questions to both of them to think about. But what I want to do is just start with a little bit of a feeling of what who are you? And what are you? And how did you get started in theater? And why did you decide to direct? And why do you like directing better than acting? Why did you decide to direct, and did you like directing better than acting? And what I'm going to do is give them turns. So we'll start with Mr. Ballas, because this is his home theater.
Oh boy, okay, so who I am is fairly easy. Nicholas, aka Nico Ballas. I've been here in Santa Fe since the early 80s, shortly after I left Los Angeles, where I had done my master's degree at Cal Arts with Robert Benedetti, who is essentially the reason I came west rather than staying east. It was one of those things where it was like, okay, Tish accepted me, Cal Arts accepted me, Benny was at Cal Arts, that's why I went there. And then I came here, bumped into Benny 10 years ago when he was out here teaching a Screen Actors Guild workshop, which I thought he had come out to from LA to teach, and he said, no, I've retired here. And more or less, that was where we started talking about, well, let's start to play here. And a couple of other principals, John Richards and Barbara Hatch, notably popped in, and that was the birth of Actors Lab, along with some other hearty mates.
Suzanne
and there's Charles Campbell, where and Akushla in the early Shakespeare pieces. But so I am the artistic director now, along with Benny, who is the managing director, and I'm in my second full year as artistic director. We worked together during the 2020 season, which was brilliant, but nobody saw it because of COVID. So, do I like acting better than directing? No, it depends. I can switch those hats interchangeably. I'm still, thank God, the lines still stick in my head. I think there will come a day when directing is easier psychologically on me, because the terrors that I have about memorization are pretty directly related to the arc of my age. But anyway,
did you take any classes in acting and or directing?
Oh, well, I did my master's work at Cal Arts, so yeah, I took a lot of classes there. Sat in on directing classes there, and mostly the directing work came out of working with some very good directors and some very bad ones. You learn as much from a bad director as you learn from a good director, I believe. And what else good. No preference between the two, and currently this piece here is what is up Simpatico, which I'm directing in and acting in. So I ordinarily don't do, I did that once before with Pinter's No Man's Land, and I did Spooner, which is a massive part, never leave stage, and I swore I would never do it again after that, but here I am doing it again. But two very, very small, concise scenes which don't mess my head up like Spooner did. Anyway, that's the long and short of it. Married, live here with my wonderful wife who's a psychotherapist, and I think that's why we've been married for 23 years.
Great, that's a wonderful introduction. Colin, can you beat that? So, where did you start off studying, and what brought you to theater, directing, and acting?
Yeah, well, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, in the Seattle area, and I started theater when I was in high school, backstage, on stage, acting and all that, and I decided to pursue it professionally, so I went to school in North Carolina, because that's where most people go to when they want a professional career. Go to North Carolina. And I actually went there very intentionally because it was one of the first state-funded arts conservatories. It was founded in the 60s by John Ely and Rosemary Harris, amongst others. And my mentor there was Gerald Friedman, who most people don't know his name, but he was Jerome Robbins' assistant on West Side Story and Gypsy. He founded Shakespeare in the Park with Joe Papp, and he directed the very first production of Hair.
Whoa.
So he directed a lot of the first Shakespeare productions at Shakespeare in the Park, and he had a real long Broadway relationship. So going there really was a classical training factory, shipping people up to New York. And I went there to be the next great actor. I wanted to be in England. I wanted to be on stage. And about 2 years in, I realized, oh, everybody else in my class, all 24 of them, were way better than I was. Way better. And I had anxiety, a lot of anxiety. If I had known then what I know now, I have ADHD, and ADHD and anxiety are sort of interwebbed. And so as an actor on stage, my ADHD made me hyper-aware of everything and every audience member's ideas of what I was doing wrong and doing right. Whereas when I sat in the director's chair, when I finally said halfway through my training, I want to be a director, my ADHD actually was a great asset to sit there in the director's chair and look at everything that the actors were doing and saying, how could I help them do that better? Well, what time is it? Are we going over time? We need to take a break. Let's see, so it allowed me to focus my efforts in a really wonderful way. And that's how I sort of found directing. After I graduated college, I of course moved to where? China. And organized an international arts festival in China with a couple friends. Did that for about 6 months, then moved back to Seattle, didn't know what to do, and got a fellowship at the Kennedy Center, and that brought me to DC for 15 years. And I did everything from take photos at theater production photography for many years. That's how I made my income. Worked for the Department of State on International Cultural Visitors Program. You do a number of things in DC. And I directed all over town. I eventually became an artistic director, had a wonderful run, produced some amazing plays, built some amazing community in a really under-resourced part of DC. And right before the pandemic, I was like, I'm out. Great person to take over. I'm moving back to Seattle. I'm going to start a new career in Seattle. 6 months before the pandemic hit. And so all of a sudden I was doing nothing in Seattle for a minute. And as the pandemic was waning, I got a call from Robin saying, do you want to come out to Santa Fe? We no longer have a managing director. I know you run a theater in the past. And when I ran a theater in DC, I was both artistic director and managing director in one, which I would have loved to have talked to your wife at that time. That was difficult. And so when Robin asked if I could come out as the interim managing director, I really leapt at the opportunity to not have to bifurcate my artistic mind and my producing mind, and leapt at the opportunity as a white cisgendered man, the opportunity to support a woman in a leadership position with what I had learned. The time that I had was great, but as an artistic director, but I don't need that role anymore, and to really support Robin and her vision. And so I left at that opportunity, and then the land of entrapment. I'm still here 2.5 years later.
We thought this was a part-time gig.
Yes, exactly. I thought this was a consulting. But yeah, so now I still live in West Seattle a little bit. My partner and I have a condo in West Seattle, so I sort of bounce back and forth, but I spend, I'd say, 75% of my time here in New Mexico and about 25 on my sailboat in Seattle.
Not bad.
Yeah, no, it's not much.
You do need some downtime after doing everything you're doing. Well, thank you,
I hope
Colin.
that game's all right.
Yeah, this is fascinating to know a little bit about you. Any deep, dark, hidden secrets that we should know about?
When I was in high school, I used to restore antique automobiles. So most theater people don't know how to rewire a car.
I'm not going to ask about deep, dark secrets.
There is a mug shot if you do some searching under my name. My Doberman put me in jail. There's a story to that. It's not a shaggy dog story, it's a real one.
It's a sleep dog story.
They put me in the slammer for a night.
Well, we're going back in time to where you met Sam Shepard, because I'm intrigued about how you developed a relationship with him.
Sure. Sam, even when I was still back east, before I migrated west to study Urbanian, et cetera, Cal Arts, doing theater in Boston and in Maine, Sam was at that, this was in the late 70s, early 80s, and Sam was nascent and hot, and he was shaking things up big time, and I was enamored. He was acting and writing God, because he was really changing the paradigms about what theater was and how it came across the stage. You're coming out of the O'Neills and Williams and Millers and a more staid kind of structured format, and Shepard just blew it open, and I was like, that's great stuff, I like that. It's kind of a rock and roll playwright. So I had him on a pedestal, even going west and studying him when I was at Cal Arts and doing workshopping and then I moved to Santa Fe. And as I leave LA, had enough of LA, just didn't take long. And I joked to my friends there. I said, I'll let you know how it's going. I'll be having dinner with Sam and Jessica, and I'll tell you how 6 months later I was having dinner with Sam and Jessica with Rosemary, with the Pink Adobe back in the good old days. And Sam was a very active patron of my bar, the bar I ran here. I have a career in the restaurant business as well, and those of you who don't know, the Cowgirl is still a major player there. I was part of the founding group who started that place. But at that time, I ran a restaurant, bar, mostly bar, called the Lone Wolf Cafe, and Sam took a great liking to it. In fact, he had a table that he always sat at, and we all knew what Sam drank. He had it with a silver, and he drank copious amounts of it. And I'm not telling stories out of school here. Everybody knew that Sam drank a lot, and everybody knows that he drank a lot. And if you see any of his plays, you understand. He drinks a lot, and he likes to investigate how that affects people, mostly men. And I served Sam over and over, and we talked theater, and we talked liquor, and we talked relationships, and I got to know him pretty well. And that pedestal kept getting a little bit shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, and soon it was just another man, another very damaged man, another very hurt man with a lot of pain. And that has informed so many of my choices about how I approach his work, which is no longer reverential. This is a real guy with real feelings. And if it's not reflected on stage, if we do the cowboy show, the cowboy poet show, we failed. It has to be about real people going through real emotions. And that's how I met him, how I knew him. He was very protective of his work. He didn't want any of it done in Santa Fe while he was living, which was rather interesting. He didn't want it done wrong. He didn't want it done in at all. So there was a moratorium on his work for a good hunk of time.
Well, when you say you didn't want it done at all, was that just in Santa Fe?
Just in Santa Fe. Yeah,
So he
yeah.
didn't
He
want
didn't
to-
believe, he didn't believe that there were the people, professionals to handle it.
Ah. Okay, fair
And
enough.
I wish you were still around. I really do. I think about him every now and then saying, damn, if he'd seen the production that Benny directed of Ages of the Moon 4 years ago, was that, I think, five?
Yeah, you and Paul Blott.
Paul Blott
and
came
that-
up from Albuquerque to do that, and this, and.
That was kind of for the anniversary of his death.
This right after he died.
Right
Yes,
after he
right after
died.
he died, right.
Yeah, so that was, I hope some people here saw it. It was a lovely production.
Thank you.
But that was a journey. And had you acted in other Sam Shepard before that?
Yeah, I directed some stuff before he got to town. I was directing, actually after he got to town, I directed True West here and the theater company I was running, which was down in the rail yard. We also did a production of Fool for Love. I did Cowboy Mouth and Suicide in B flat also. So yeah.
So you've done a fair amount of Shepard.
Yeah.
So you've got this one up on its feet after, this is the first week.
Yep.
I'm kind of intrigued. You told me a little bit about knowing Sam and how that informed how you worked on one of his plays. Do you get the feeling that he's looking over your shoulder?
In a good way, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's nice to know the man and to know how really critical he was about the work that having his work produced, and yet to be able to explore it with a sense of not being overly reverential. That he was an awfully good writer. He gives actors really good stuff to play with, and I got a note from somebody who saw the show and commented specifically about the character I play here, Ames/Sims. Ames also appears in the Ages of the Moon, interestingly enough, but about the musicality, and Sam was a musician as well. So the music and the rhythms and the patterns of metrical construction that he uses are so wonderful to explore the poetry. And the writer who came to see the show who commented on those aspects of the show were quite favorably. Thought that you had fun with that stuff. I said, well, it's like, when you get lines like you must have prayed to Penny, that papa, and all these kind of alliterations and whatnot. Sam gave us a lot to work with. So yes, he lurks.
He lurks on the back of your shoulder.
In a good way.
So that would be interesting. Colin, I'm going to segue because you're dealing with a living playwright who you not only know and have worked with this year, but who acted in the performance. So we have a director who's acting in his own performance. We have a playwright who's acting in his own performance. These are tricky things. Not just over your shoulder, but there. How did that inform how you directed it?
Well, I think that any time that there's a living playwright, especially if they're in the room, it informs a lot of things, but it really depends on the playwright. It's so unique because you could have a playwright that is in the room but just does not care and is just like a kid in a candy store, just like, what are you going to do with it? Or you could have a playwright that's like, that word, that specific word, there was a comma there. It's like, yeah, there's a comma. And David was a really wonderful playwright to work with. I think David's partner, Antonio, comes from a background as a director and has directed this piece before. And Antonio was in the piece. So not only did I have a playwright in the piece, but a previous director of this piece in the piece. But the beauty of it is that Antonio comes from a background not only as an actor and as a director, but also an intimacy director, which is a new, does everybody know what an intimacy director is? It's a sort of a new part in our field.
Really,
Yeah, so it's like a new part in our field where it's like there's the director and there's like a fight choreographer that choreographs the fight. Well, the intimacy director makes sure that any simulated sex is safe. and that there's a lot of consent in the room, and it can be very challenging with an intimate director because they can get in the way of a relationship that the director has with the actors, and it can become overly precious. Or it can be really beautiful, and they can make it a really safe room where people aren't taken advantage of, people aren't guilt-tripped into doing things they don't want to do. And I bring that up because both David and Antonio come from a background of intimacy direction and awareness of the beginnings of that field within our field, or that movement within our field and that position within our field. So both of them come with very healthy boundaries. They're both on staff at the Playhouse, and we at the Playhouse are really building a staff and a culture of consent, of, you know, can we have a meeting tomorrow at 2 o'clock? Do you consent to that? Instead of, we're meeting at 2 o'clock to talk about that thing. And so from the beginning of the rehearsal process, we sat down at the very first rehearsal and said, what are the agreements that we're all agreeing to? We're all agreeing that we're going to be on time. One would assume that every theater artist already agrees to that. We don't all. We're going to agree that we're going to get off book by the time we're going to say we're going to be memorized. And so with Antonio and David, there were some specific boundaries and agreements that we as a cast had. Like, if we're in the rehearsal process and somebody doesn't like a line or is confused by a line, we're not going to turn to David, the actor, and say, well, what did you mean as a playwright? Because it's unfair to David, and it's unkind to him. So instead, we'll try to figure it out as a group, and then say, hey, stage manager, can you put it in the rehearsal report to ask the playwright what they meant by that, if they would like to share that with us. Otherwise, we will figure it out on our own. So we really try to treat it not in a precious way, as if David weren't in the room, as if the playwright was in New York, and we got the royalties to produce this play, and we got to figure it out on our own. And there were times where, in rehearsal, David would be like, I'm happy to help answer that question, because we're all fumbling. But by and large, there were really healthy boundaries set in place. And I never felt as a director like either of them were trying to force my hand one way or another. There were some times where like I could tell that they did not agree with the direction I thought it wanted to go, but they were like, let's go, let's try it, okay, this is your production. And there were a couple times where after rehearsal I was like, can we sit and talk for a minute? Antonio, you've directed this play before. David, you wrote this play. I'm all ears. I, as a director, do not think of the director as the dictator in the room. I feel like I'm a facilitator in the room. And the best answer in the room is the answer that needs to be explored and discovered. So for me, there's a vulnerability as a director in leading the group from the outside of the circle, facilitating that conversation. So I was happy to hear any suggestion they had. And even though I thought it should go in one direction, I could tell that they didn't. So tell me what you're feeling, tell me what you're thinking. Let's find where it wants to go for this production. And I felt like both David as the playwright and as the actor, and Antonio as the actor and previous director were never really, did I feel like there were any tensions there?
That's terrific.
Yeah, it's not always the case.
No. Have you ever had experiences with a live playwright in the room where you've been directing?
Oh, sure, yeah. The very first show that I directed in Santa Fe was a piece that was written by Will Collins, who was, it was one of his earlier PO, he's not writing anymore, dead, but anyway, it was a piece of Gertrude Stein poetry, mostly, and I took a pretty radical approach to how to stage it with these large cubes with letters on it that kept getting configured into different words, finally rose, rose, rose. And he was entirely enamored with 90% of what I did, and 10% of material that we bumped up against each other, we would generally sit and have a drink and discuss it and work it out. Not always over alcohol, but that seemed to be his chosen means of communicating, and it was fine. On the contrary, there have been other times that I've worked with playwrights in the same room, they shall remain nameless at this point, where it was not so comfortable, and it did come down to there's a comma after that word kind of dialogue. And often in production, there's a flow that the actors begin to find to the words. It doesn't exist on the page. And I think if a playwright resists the opportunity to find the magic that happens as it moves from page into the actor on stage, then there's some of the magic is lost, because there's the whole creative process has many different levels, and if the playwright is constantly holding on to their words, tenaciously holding on to their words, it can get a little bit wonky.
Well, now, did you find that when you read the play beforehand, that you had a very clear vision of where you wanted to go? Or did you not start off with a vision? Did you, how did you approach your, I mean, a lot of directors' work is done before you even get to rehearsal, but how did you approach that pre-work situation? When you had Antonio and David there, did you have a chance to talk to them beforehand, or did you not?
I had, I think, a 30-minute conversation with David about what inspired him to write the play, and that's about all. And then there's like 2 or 3 different catchphrases that I love. One is the map is not the terrain. So I spent a lot of time thinking about plays and thinking about the world of them and how the story might unfold. But once you get into rehearsal, everything changes because the map is not the terrain. And the other one that I love comes from Adrienne, I don't remember who said that one, but Adrienne Marie Brown wrote this amazing book called Emergent Strategies. And she says, less preparation, more presence. And so for me, and I love that you use the word vision, I hate the word concept. Because to me, concept is an idea layered on top of a play. And I don't fault anybody, if anybody else is a director and loves the word concept, really not judging you for it. It's my thing. My mentor hated the word concept. He drilled that into me. But concept to me is an outside idea put on top of a play. And what I'm always looking for as a director is how to, like a flower, let the play bloom and find the way that the story needs to be told. So for me, vision is about vision. It's about looking at the play over and over again and listening to it over and over again until it sort of reveals itself to you. And that sounds super like touchy-feely, it reveals itself to you. And I don't mean it in that way. I mean it in the way that like you're peeling back layers until you find the heart of it. And then that beating heart is what allows you to move forward. And so for me, I think that I realized after reading the play enough times that the heart of this play was the moments, tiny moments. How many people saw Baby Monitor? So a number of us. For me, the heart of the play was tiny little moments where one could have chosen to say one thing or a different thing and didn't. And for me, as I read it, maybe for the first time, the moment where Claire, at the very end, he calls her a bigot, she says some terrible things, and he says, what it feels like to be gay is this. It is not a sexual thing. It feels like I love this other human being. And she has the opportunity to say, wow, I've just learned something. Wow, I was wrong. Wow, I've hurt you. I'm so sorry. And for many different reasons, she says, where are you moving? And for me, the heart of the play is the infinity of time where she makes the decision not to apologize, not to acknowledge her vulnerability, and instead does the white supremacy culture WASP BS thing of, anyway, where are you moving? I'm just going to cover that, not deal with that trauma. You know, instead of laying herself bare and saying, I'm vulnerable, I'm wrong. And I've learned this from my partner. Like, there are arguments that I've gotten into with my partner where I'm like, oh, I'm wrong. I need to, as a man, as a person that was socialized to believe I'm a man, I need to lay down my man card and say, it's okay to be vulnerable and wrong. And it's okay to not know how to take the next step forward. And I think that's what Claire doesn't do. And I think that's where a lot of people that have been socialized to believe that we're white don't do, is, oh my God, I said something that's racist. Somebody called me on it. I'm the worst human being in the world. I can't continue with this. No, I'm sorry. That was terrible. Everybody says racist things at times. That doesn't make it okay. How do I even move forward? And that's the heart of the play for me.
Did you discover that when you were reading it?
Oh, the first time I read it, I saw a scene from it in the walk, the
theater walk.
Yeah. We did a scene from it before we even programmed it in the season. We did a scene from it in the very last scene in the theater walk. And when I saw that scene, I was like, oh, that's the heart of this play. Like, that moment is the most important moment. And David, Antonio, and Robin were doing the scene together, and they were like, do you have any notes? And I was like, oh, just that pause before you say, where are you moving? It can be as long as you want, like 5 minutes. And I would sit there for 5 minutes watching it. And I think that's why David was like, I don't call him the director. Because I understood that needed that space, you know? And then from there, it was just like, it's such an intimate moment that I can't have a moat between the audience and the performers for that intimate moment. They can't be witnessing that intimate moment. They need to be in it and so invested in it, and other people need to be watching that. That, like, as uncomfortable as that is, you need to feel the pressure, because that's how we learn in theater. So, and then it just went from there, I guess.
Well, you've done a lot of Sam Shepard, so in some ways you've done a lot of preparation before you went in.
Well, I wanted to go back to your comment about most of the work with directing happens before you go into rehearsals, because my experience is rather opposite of that, because once you are in rehearsals, when the actual play starts to, I think, unfold, maybe the verb that you use there, the process is mostly dictated by the interactions that the actors are bringing to the words and to the natural tendencies for blocking. I have worked with directors who have blocked the whole damn play out before you go into rehearsal, and it drives me batty because it doesn't leave the opportunity for exploration. So I want to work with actors who are capable of standing on their own 2 feet, figuring out whether the impulse is coming out of textual need or random wandering, and I don't have many of those in core company anymore. Well, not anymore that we've eliminated or anything. But the discovery process must come, I believe, when the director and the actors are there with the text, a la minute, figuring out what makes this thing cook. And I can't do that ahead of time because, number one, I don't necessarily know who the cast is. And number two, I don't know how those interactions are going to translate from the page to the mouths of the actors. And they change. They're very subtle. They change from night to night, even on stage, within specific parameters. But unless the actors are given that freedom to continue to explore, as they did in rehearsal throughout the run of the show, I'm not sure that we're going to play the service of it, because it's a living, breathing, organic thing. I'm not sure we're giving it its due.
Well, I think you said something earlier that I think is absolutely true, that what you're doing on stage is telling a story.
Well, yeah.
Actors and directors. Now, I've always thought that directors come into the first rehearsal with a really solid idea of a whole story that they're telling.
Sure.
But actors come in with, this is my story, and this is the way I'm going to tell it.
But I'm constantly asking actors how that particular scene, how those choices, how do they serve the arc of the story, so that we all understand what the spine, what the flow of, the beginning, middle, end. And I learned from, there was this guy along the way, I think Cagliari says, an Aristotelian kind of, but that structure is intact, and that structure, the beginning, middle, end, the flow of it is something that as humans we really resonate with that arc. And if, even in a given sentence, if it doesn't have a beginning, middle, end, we feel a little disappointed. So the play itself must have a clearly defined arc, and the actors must understand what that is so that they can get to the crisis moments prepared and ready to make that cook. And then, you know, the further points along the way, the denouement, et cetera, can be clearly articulated. And if that doesn't happen, you don't have a play. You just have a bunch of scenes, and we don't want that.
Well, how do you communicate that arc to the actors? Is this something you talk about at the very beginning, or you work through during rehearsal?
It happens during rehearsal, and if the play is written well enough, which most plays that hopefully we all choose have enough structure to support that, you'll get to a point in the rehearsal process and you'll go, yeah, you feel this, this is a crisis moment. And then boom, that's your climax there. From here on in, you can roll this down to the finish. Let's drive toward the finish line here because we've already had that big moment. Right? And you don't have to keep hitting those moments along the way. You know, actors love to hit those moments. They adore. I'm having a moment, please. No, come on. You gotta get to the end of the play.
Can I throw something in there?
Sure, please, Tom.
I think that there's a really fascinating thing that happens, and I'd be interested to see if you agree, that like before the play starts, rehearsals, I've read the play 20 times, 30 times. I might not have written down all my notes, but I probably did. I probably sketched things and erased them. I love pencils. Sketch them and erase them. So when we start rehearsals on that very first day, I probably know all of the characters and a lot of the nuanced moments that connect everything better than the actors. Because most often, they're getting paid to do this, and they've read the play once or twice, and they're showing up and kind of reading it fresh. So at the beginning of rehearsal, I know more than they do, and they know less than I do. But as the rehearsal goes over, they start to know their characters way better than I do. And they start to know them, by the time we get to opening, they are living their characters on stage. And I'm only witnessing and giving them tiny little notes about things, because all of those things that I knew at the beginning have helped them on their journey to knowing the characters so much better than I do. So I think that the work that we do is prepping ourselves to be guides on the journey of the rehearsal process, so that those actors can go from not knowing the characters well to living them, quite literally living them on stage.
The discovery of character to me is slightly secondary to their discovery of what the story, what the flow of the text needs to be, or what the structure of the play is. Character is lovely, but I think that most playwrights give any number of clues as to what the character is going to be, and that will change too, depending on who is cast. So
that brings up another question. If you have a really strong vision, or you've read the play a lot, you have an idea of what who these characters are, and how you've got an audition process or not. How do you choose a cast? Are you open for surprises for casting? But are you looking for somebody who's physically or emotionally close to your idea of a character?
I don't think about it so much in terms of character as how the story is going to be told. And there are going to be variations based on who ends up being cast in the way the story unfolds. And sometimes we'll cast somebody, and for one reason or another, they need to be replaced before or early in the rehearsal period, hopefully, but sometimes it happens later on. And when that person is replaced, the show changes. So I think to go in with this rigid sense of character is doing the play a disservice, because a different actor will bring different energy and different sensitivity to what the text is. And if I'm not open to that, I'm not doing my job.
So did you have already set cast when you went to work on Baby Monitor, or were you allowed to choose your cast?
It would have been stupid of me to not cast David Monitor. It kind of came with the territory, definitely, that David, but Antonio as well. They were natural for that. They've already done it numerous times. So in a way, they came with the production, and I was very happy for that. We cast everybody else based on auditions, and Laura Laura actually didn't audition. Laura Gomez, who played Soledad, she went to school with Antonio in the DR, and I was really happy that we were able to cast the show, which was written to have 2 actors who are from the Dominican Republic with 2 people from the Dominican Republic. And so when I found out that Laura was interested in the production, knew her work, I was like, yes. And David literally wrote the show based on Antonio's friend Laura. So like, it was written for her. And I was very happy with that casting choice. But then the 3 other people came in and auditioned, and I will say I cast very, I wouldn't say flippantly, but I cast based on impulses and on type. And a lot of people think that typecasting is really reductive and terrible. And I think that's because typecasting is a really bad name. A lot of people think of typecasting as the beautiful ingenue, the not so beautiful best friend. Right? That's like the 2 types that exist for women. And that like, but it's not true. Type has nothing to do with what you look like. It has to do with who you are. It's more about archetypes to me, type. I'm also a headshot photographer. So for me, to know how to take a good headshot, I need to know who you are at your core. What is your archetype? And there is no one archetype. There's like 2 or 3. And I love it. If you think about archetypes like the wizard, like medieval archetypes, or what is the whole thing of art? I forget.
Commedia.
Or commedia dell'arte, absolutely. But like, if you think about like a wizard, a commander-in-chief, a king, a fool.
These are tarot kinds of things.
Yeah, basically, absolutely, absolutely. What would Robin Williams type be if Robin Williams had a type? I think he'd be the philosopher jester, right? So he has 2 different types that embody his spirit when he walks in a room. And if you know what the spirit or the heart of the character is, then when an actor auditions, you're not auditioning for what you're seeing. You're auditioning for how they walk through the world, how they process information, and how aligned they are with how that character processes information. And that's why casting opposite type is a lot of work, because that actor is now trying to put themselves completely in somebody else's shoes and understand how this other person lives in the world. Whereas when you cast 2 type, it flows very fluidly, or it can flow very fluidly. So for me, auditioning is like, I could see 5 people and I'd be like, okay, that's the person I want to cast. I also want to cast people that are nice to work with and kind with me. So when somebody auditions and like they, step on the monitor's foot and they say, why haven't I been called in yet? I don't want to work with that person. I might not cast that person based on the fact that they treated somebody like out in the lobby. But to me, casting is really just about trusting impulses. I don't care how romantic the scene is, I never need to see 2 actors read together. I could cast Romeo and Juliet and cast Romeo and Juliet reading opposite, never reading opposite each other. I don't need to see people more than once in an audition. And I'm not saying like I'm a great director and I'm the best at casting. I'm just saying like, it's not that difficult. And I think sometimes directors make it this complex thing where they need to see people over and over again. Make sure that we're actors, we're professionals, and we can manufacture that love and energy and dynamic in a proper rehearsal room. And so for me, it's about making sure you,
Well, it's interesting because I think both the Playhouse and the New Mexico Actors Lab are developing sort of a pool of actors that they know, they trust, and have worked with over and over again. But that's something that seems to be developing over time. How did that come about for New Mexico Actors Lab?
And we always started with the concept of a core company and something that would grow based on the needs of the plays and also based on what the community happened to be bringing forth. And we have had open auditions along the way, not as frequently as some companies do, but it's nice to see who's out there. I do make an effort to try to get out, and apologies I did not see your monitor, but to get out as much as possible and see shows that are being produced, because I like to see actors on stage. I despise auditions, both as an actor and as a casting person, because it's an artificial environment, devoid of any of the support of the real magic of the stage. So going out to see a show and seeing actors in a show gives me a sense of, well, what are they going to be doing in an actual play situation? So it's a very different picture than standing here and saying, and I have this piece, and I have this piece, and we're going to be doing it. It just feels terribly artificial. And the work shines much more in the actors' hands when they're working in a staged play dynamic. So from the core company, we know the directors, and up to now, Benny and I have done most of the directing. I have one new director this year. Barbara Hatch directed a number of years ago for us. But we know who is available to us, and we also have actors who have worked together a lot. So casting them, immediately we have a sense of how they're going to behave with each other and what magic can happen. I'll just use Jeff Pomeroy and Joy Beth Gilbert, for example. A couple of years ago, we did a production of Lungs. It was a two-hander, and they were the entire play, just the two of them. No scene, no scenery, no props, no music, no support, just the two of them. Remarkable. And they are in many of the scenes in this particular show, Sam Shepard, Simpatico. And I knew, I had a sense right away before we even began rehearsals of what their working habits would be, how they would align with each other, how much hand-holding I would need to do for each and every one of them, how they would be able to support each other. So there's a huge jump on just that knowledge base before going into rehearsals of, well, I know what's going to happen here, or I have a good sense of what's going to happen here. And we keep building on that. We keep adding people as they come to town, and every now and then we have attrition, but not often. And we keep working with the same people over and over, and there's a deepest level of trust that I've seen among actors in quite a few years here. And that there is overlap too, which is a wonderful thing. There are a couple of people who are working in the Lynn Nottage and Sweat. Scott Harrison, for example, who will be working with us later in the year doing JQA. Danielle Reddick, likewise, who will be also in JQA. So the number of highly skilled actors in town is relatively finite, so there's going to be some inevitable overlap of talent.
And I've been noticing that although there's a lot of new people coming into Santa Fe Playhouse, which is wonderful, that we've seen a lot of the same faces. And how does casting work at the Playhouse?
Well, you'll have to talk to Antonio about that.
I am, like I mentioned before, I used to be an artistic director. I'm very happy to be not in the artistic department. I'm in the management department. But in terms of casting, the bit that I do know about how we handle casting at the Playhouse is really that everybody auditions. There's a few times where people might be pre-cast, but that's usually the director making a choice with one specific person. But even Alexandra Renzo, who I had seen in multiple things, she auditioned for Baby Monster. She didn't just get cast in it. And we auditioned multiple other people for that role. So we do a kind of general season audition, and then from that, we have individual callbacks for each show. For Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder, that we're doing in the summer, this huge musical, we had a cast almost completely locally, only one out-of-town actor, and then somebody dropped out of it. So right now, we're recasting one of the roles for it, and it looks like we're going to have to cast somebody out of LA. And so, like, it's a matrix, and I mean, when we do cast out of town, we have to put an ad out on Playbill, get a ton of submissions. When we did the Mountaintop last year, it's a play about Martin Luther King Jr.'s last day on Earth, and it calls for 2 black actors. And there are not a lot of black actors in Santa Fe. There are some in Albuquerque, and so like there's just not the same talent pool for that age range that is available for that show to really do a large casting session. So we spread the net very wide, and we put a thing out on Playbill up in New York, and a ton of people submitted. And we cast 2 actors, both from out of town, one from Rhode Island, and one from New York City. And so we had to invest in renting an apartment here in Santa Fe, because there's not a lot of people that are willing to give up their casitas for 2 months for an out-of-town artist. So sometimes we have to house out-of-town artists, but we really are striving to be of the community and staying local. and as much as possible casting local. I'd say with this season, 90% of our casts are local actors. And even Sweat, which you might not recognize everybody in Sweat, there's 4 actors that you probably won't really recognize. One is from Albuquerque, one is from El Paso, and then one is from New York, and one is from DC. So like, even those 2 that are from Albuquerque and El Paso are of the Southwest region. One of them has been in the show with us before. So I would consider them local in terms of New Mexico and the Southwest region. But yeah, it depends on the show. And we're really striving to do more and more diverse shows because I think that that's what we should be doing. And I'm really happy that our artistic department is heading in that direction. And if we do a show that has 3 people of Middle Eastern descent, we need to find qualified actors, the right age range, and we might not find them in Santa Fe. There's not a lot of Southeast Asian actors in Santa Fe. So it really depends on the show, how we cast it, and if the auditions are over Zoom or if they're in person. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, I've been told we have 5 minutes left, so, well, we could.
Yeah, I know.
I feel like we just got started, but I'm going to open it up to the audience. Does anybody else have another question that they're curious about that hasn't been answered? Please, because Suzanne.
I'm gonna, you're gonna be mad at me for asking this one, guys, sorry. I wanted to know, have you ever, this has happened to me, have you ever got into directing a play and realized it was such a bad fit and nothing was working, and if so, what was the play and why were you uncomfortable with it? Maybe you never have.
That has not happened to me.
Never had a disastrous experience?
No. I mean, I've had to replace actors along the way, but no, I've never gotten into a situation where I found myself working on a play that I disliked.
Yes.
No, I mean, that would be my bad for choosing the play in the first place.
All right.
I would hopefully not do that, and I fortunately have not.
Have you ever had an awkward experience in your directing?
I've unfortunately had a couple experiences where I've had to pull out of projects that I had agreed to do. And that was awkward and sad because I put some of the creative energy into it. And there was one experience I had when you mentioned that I directed in Tiblisi, Georgia, and that was one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. It was a promenade-style play where the audience walks around with the performers about a cult leader who has all of his cult members commit suicide at this piece of performance art. It was in Tiblisi, Georgia, over Easter. Tiblisi, Georgia is the second oldest Christian country in the world, so everybody was fasting
Not happy to
over
begin with.
Easter. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do it because Georgians know about autocratic leaders taking over and telling people what to do and everything. So there's a lot of tension in putting on the play. And these are also performers in Georgia who are used to putting on lots of makeup, big costumes, performing on a proscenium, and I asked them to wear street clothes. They were playing themselves, and it was not easy. The audiences loved it because they'd never seen anything like it. And at the end of the day, the performers loved it too. But there were multiple times in that rehearsal process where I didn't speak the language as well.
I'm remembering now. There was a production of Troilus and Cressida that I was doing, and this was with a repertory company in New England, in Maine specifically, and I was playing Troilus, and the director decided to put the concept of football, American football. It was the Trojans against the Greeks, and I was the quarterback of the Trojan team. And I don't think Shakespeare liked it very much because we were in an amphitheater, and it rained 8 out of the 10. So he put us out of our misery. Thank you. But it was a little bit awkward getting geared up in the helmet and trying to duck up for like, all right, once more into the breach.
Well, that happens in Shakespeare more often than not because I think directors are very much afraid that the audience is not going to get Shakespeare. And yet, have you directed Shakespeare?
I did a post-apocalyptic production of Hamlet shortly after getting to town in the CCA, that big warehouse next door, which we did tennis court style, bleacher style, running up and down. You had the walls of the city on one end and the court of Elsinore on the other end. Lots of stuff in the middle. And Mad Max-like dripping costumes before Mad Max came out. And it was great fun. People were raising a couple of eyebrows, but it helped. The tribalism was really what I was going for. And I think that essentially him has a lot of tribalism in his background. So yeah, I threw a little bit of my
Your
vision,
concept.
my vision on it. No, vision. Note to self, excise that word.
Does anybody else have a last question? Yes.
Well, when you had to fire and replace actors, did they get it, or did they think they were doing fine?
I haven't had to fire anybody, so and I had to replace somebody because they ended up in jail in Texas. that was awkward, but somebody came in and did the job. And then when I opened the little theater company that I had in the rail yard, this was in the mid '80s, we did start with a play that my actors decided they wanted to get in real deep character with it, and they went down to El Paso and drank themselves into a good bender, and then on the way back blew a water pump. And so my opening night, I was standing up there to my assembled audience, apologizing for the fact that we weren't going to go up today; it would be tomorrow. But, that was awkward.
Yeah.
So I've never had to fire an actor per se like that. You had to fire anybody?
I don't know that I've ever had to let an actor go. I think that the harder thing is letting a director go, because it's so subjective as an artistic director in terms of whether the director's doing their job or not. And if it gets to the point where you have to let them go, they usually don't think that it's that bad. So it's this like perception of like, no, it's fine. And you want to trust their process, because every director's process is different. And that's the biggest challenge, I think. It's not so much letting an actor go, although that can be challenging, but it's when the director is not bringing the piece to where it needs to go. When do you make that call? And how do you do it? And with what grace do they step down or step up to the plate?
Well, thank you both. Artistic directors have shows. So, Colin, what is going on at the Playhouse now?
The next thing at the Santa Fe Playhouse is Lynn Nottage's Pulitzer Prize-winning Sweat. It opens on Saturday. The very first preview is on Thursday and Friday. Both Thursday and Friday previews are pay what you want, pay what you will. You can pay $3, you can pay $30, you can pay $300. It runs till June 10th. It's really stunning. Robin Raccoon directed it. Highly encourage it. And then immediately after that, we have a presented piece, which is a one-woman hip-hop theater piece about civil rights for Latine people. It came about because in elementary school, raised their hand and asked the teacher that was talking about Rosa Parks, where did I sit on the bus? Where did we sit on the bus? And the teacher said, you weren't on the bus. And so they said, oh, really? So their whole life they sort of excavated and asked, where did the Latino people live in the civil rights movement and in the course of the 20th century? And really it's a beautiful piece exploring that. One person with like musical gear and rapping on top of loops. It's really beautiful. So those are the two next pieces that we have coming up.
And Nico, you're in the middle of very
We are
exciting
moving into our
production.
second week of Simpatico. We had our strongest first week opening of any show, I believe, that we've had historically. It was a very strong first week. We go into weeks 2 and 3 rocking, and then we will close that and open Morning Sun by Simon Stephens that Benny is directing, and that will open the first week of June.
So we've got choices in Santa Fe.
Yay!
Yay!
prove us wrong that, oh, you can't have these going on simultaneously, it steals from the other. I believe firmly that the more theater creates more theater.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
we have 3-week runs, even if you go to the Playhouse, doesn't mean you can't come here, vice versa. So keep it going, keep it going.
Then we can have this venue.
There's gonna be restaurants. Yeah. Well, let's do it.
So